So welcome everyone. My name is Brooke Edmonds and I'm with OSU Extension in Lynn and Benton counties and are coordinating this webinar series. So I am really pleased to introduce our two speakers today. And I'm going to do the introduction and then I'm going to let them go through and pull up their slides and get started there. So first we have Heather Stoven, and she's the Community and Small Farms Horticulturist for Yamhill County, where she oversees the Master Gardener Program and supports the community's gardening and small farm needs. And she has a wide breadth of experience in horticulture, working with the nursery industry, propagation, pest management, media preparation, fertility, and irrigation. And then our co-presenter today is Victoria Binning, and she is the Agriculture Program Coordinator for Marion County. And she works with both small farms and the community horticulture program. And she focuses on beginning farmer education, outreach, and supporting the Marion County Master Gardener Program. So we're just going to take a few moments here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then we'll let Victoria pull up her presentation. And so any folks that are coming a little bit late, if you do have questions for the presenter, please put them into the Q&A box. And I think, let's see, are you guys ready to go?
I'm ready. Are you ready, Heather?
I'm ready.
Awesome.
Okay, let's do this. I love that soundtrack at the beginning because I feel like so upbeat now. Love olives. Yeah, thank you, Brooke, for that lovely introduction. And hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. We are going to be talking about olives in Oregon, a little bit about our research that we've been doing as part of the OLEA project team, and then some recommendations for you all if you want to grow olives, which I assume you do, and if you're here for something else, well, this is your opportunity to duck out. We are part of the OLEA project team. Oop. There we go. Our team got together. We are an OSU Extension research team, and we got together in 2017 when the olive growers of Oregon approached OSU and said, hey, we want to know about what the best recommendations are for growing olives in Oregon, and there hadn't been any research done on that. So our team consists of Javier Fernandez Salvador, who is our principal investigator and in charge of the uppotting trial, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. Heather Stoven, our rock star propagation specialist, who you're gonna have the opportunity to hear from. Tessa Barker is our graduate research assistant, and she's really like boots on the ground doing absolutely everything. She is amazing. Neil Bell is the community horticulturalist here in Marion and Polk counties. He's helping us figure out which cultivars do best. And then there's me, and I run around talking about outreach and education opportunities for olives. So, olives. Weird thing to grow in Oregon. That's why we haven't done it before. However, a lot of our olive growers, were curious about how to grow olives in this climate because one, who knows, it might be the next Pinot Noir, right? A few decades ago, everyone would have thought you were crazy for growing wine grapes in Oregon, but perhaps there's another new thing on the horizon because as climate change makes its way up to our neck of the woods, we're experiencing longer, hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. And the growers who are currently growing olives in Oregon are looking to this as a potential crop for climate change, addressing climate change. But I have a little olive trivia for you because olives are not from Oregon. They are from the Mediterranean, and they've been grown in the Mediterranean for a very long time. But how long exactly? We have a handy dandy little poll for you that I'm hoping Brooke can pull up.
All right, so we're going to launch that poll again, answer it like the same way, and so you might have to look for that little window. All right, so here it goes. Same questions up there. Oh, you guys are going quick this time. Awesome. So we've got 55 folks. We'll let it go just for a few more seconds and see if we can catch some people. And again, if the poll isn't working for you, you can just try to answer that on your own, or if you're watching a recording, you can pause it and take a look. All right, so can you guys see that results, Heather and Victoria?
Beautiful. Why are we even giving this webinar? You guys know.
Right.
Yeah, the correct answer was B. 7,000 years ago is when we believe that olive cultivation began in the Mediterranean. We believe that olives originated in the Syria region, but we also think that humans have only been, engaged in agriculture for the past, 6,000 to 10,000 years. So it's pretty significant that olives were one of the first things on the scene. And this tree down here in the bottom, you can see is an olive tree. I'm not going to try and pronounce that V word, but it's in Crete. And that tree is believed to be 2,000 years old. And so olives, once established, live for a very, very long time. And have been a major part of human history for centuries. And typically, olives are grown between 30 degrees and 45 degrees, either north or south in the world. They originated in the Mediterranean, but they moved down to South America in the 1600s and up to California in the 1800s, largely because of Spaniards who were taking them to various colonies and missions. And 90% of the olives that are grown worldwide are actually for olive oil production. And in the ancient world, they were using olive oil for eating, obviously, but also it was used as fuel for oil lamps. And ancient Greeks actually bathed in olive oil. So there are many uses once you get down this rabbit hole into olive production for what you might want to use your olives for. But olives originated in very rocky soil, dry climates. The Mediterranean climate, of which those of you who are in Oregon, you might know, the Willamette Valley, we're in a Mediterranean climate here. We have long, dry summers and warm, wet winters, which is the same over across the pond in the Mediterranean where olives are from. But you might take a look at those soils and notice that they don't quite look like our Oregon soils. They're really calcareous and have higher pH, are much more rocky, much better drained. This photo is from a French orchard when Heather, Neil, and I went across to France to check out some olive orchards. And you can see it's a very well-established orchard. We've got cypress in the background, rocks everywhere. It looks great. It is a little different than what we're growing, the growing conditions here in Oregon. And this photo is from right next to Pont du Gard, which is an ancient Roman aqueduct. And that is not to say that this tree is old enough to be like the same time period as the Roman aqueduct, but who knows? It might be. That's a pretty old looking tree. And they do, once established, they are very, very tolerant and live for a very long time. So within the United States, olives have been moving around a little bit. Most of the production happens in California. I think California is between 90 and 95, actually. It's probably more than that. 95% of olive production in the entire United States comes out of California. And most people know mission olives and the table olives, the little black ones you put on your fingers and put in your mouth. California does a lot of those. They also do a lot of industrial production of putting olive trees into hedges and harvesting them mechanically. California developed the mission olive. They also invented the technique that creates those black olives. It's a brining technique, but we can get into that later in the Q&A session. Just fascinating stuff. But they are a bit drier than we are up here in Oregon. And down in Texas, there's actually been a nascent olive industry developing in Texas where they have more of those calcareous soils, lots of higher pHs and lower rainfall. But they're Texas olive ranches have really been taking off. And you can see in this photo, just like just take a gander at those soils. Rocky stuff to be sure. Oh, and now we're hopping over to Heather.
Yep, so we're going to be trading back and forth a little bit here because we want to make sure everyone stays awake. Even though olives are super cool and there's probably no chance you'd fall asleep, but we're going to trade back and forth a little bit. So we talked, of course, about some of the regions that olives are grown in. And you can see that if you imagine where Oregon is on that map, we're way kind of at the northern end of things. So we do have a Mediterranean climate, although it's, you know, not quite as Mediterranean as you would see in California, for example, or Italy or Spain. We don't get quite as warm. We're colder in the wintertime. We have more rainfall. So, you know, we're kind of on that edge for olive production. And so we have probably about 20 commercial olive orchards in the state, and we have a number of people that are interested in olives. So that part is kind of cool. So it very much could grow, and we hope that it does. But right now, it's a small industry. The olive orchards that people have are pretty small, with most less than 15 acres. But the great thing about growing olives in this region is that we produce some really good olive oil, and most of the olive growers are actually producing olives for oil. And so for those that have done so, it's proven to be, you know, really good tasting and high quality. So like I said, we're kind of seeing where the industry goes, and we're trying to help them out a little bit.
Ooh. Whoa. Uh-oh. There we go.
Okay, great. So this is a map of where some of our olive growers are within Oregon. It's not all of them necessarily, but just a few. So you can see many of them are in the northern Willamette Valley. One more, it's, you know, southern Willamette Valley, and then there's a larger orchard kind of near the Roseburg area. One thing to think about too is that a lot of these are in good microclimates. All the growers that I can think of have kind of sloped sites, or especially southern slopes are good. So that's good to think about as well when growing olives, that if you have a lot of cold pockets, or if you're in a really cold area, you know, it's kind of, we're already kind of right on the verge of where olives can grow successfully. So just kind of so you can look at this map and have an idea of where, you know, where there are some commercial olive growers in the state. Okay, so some of the orchards that we have are in Polk County, and we have some in Yamhill County, and then I think Douglas County. So you can kind of look at the pictures of what those orchards look like. Not really the same as what Victoria was describing for California and southern France. And, you know, a lot of these orchards are a little bit younger in age. I'd say most of the commercial orchards that we have in the state are between 10 and 15 years old. There's, of course, some younger ones as well, but so you can kind of see what they look like after they've been established for a few years, but they're not, you know, quite as old and established as you might find in some other places at this point. So here's some olives that have been harvested, and this is actually olive harvest season in Oregon. Most of the growers that I know will be end of October, early November when olives are harvested. And it's also important to note that they can be really sensitive to frost. So it's kind of a tricky little game. You want to get them to ripen as much as possible, but not have them damaged by frost, which they can be. So note here, as I said, these are olives that have been picked. This is from last year's harvest from an olive grower. And note that they're all still green, and that they're smaller than what you would find in California. So they don't ripen fully here in Oregon, but they still produce a high quality oil. So here's an example, like I said, of what they're often used from. So here's kind of an olive tasting bar. So at this point, a number of growers will come together and send their olives through an olive mill, and then, like I said, produce that oil. There is some other growers, a few growers that are out there that are producing olives for table olives for brining. It's far less common. Like I said, most growers are using it for olive oil, which, like I said, is very tasty, and it also could be used potentially for soaps or cosmetics or that sort of thing as well. So the special challenge that I have been alluding to so far in the presentation is our weather here, being at the northern border of where olives should be grown. Although I will have to say there is a grower in British Columbia, believe it or not. So we're not the furthest north growers of olives. But so you can see in the picture, it's a lovely dramatic scene with a lot of snow, but actually I don't think snow is so much the issue as temperature. So I'd say once we get below like 10 or 15 degrees, then you're kind of hitting the lower edge of where olives want to be, and you're going to start to have some plant damage. So kind of keep that in mind, that most years, like the last couple of years, the lowest temperatures we've had have been probably in the lower 20s, which has been great for olives, and we haven't seen olive damage. But when you have those really cold, unusual winters, then those can cause problems.
Okay, so Heather, yeah, thank you, Heather, for the sort of explanation of what we're doing in Oregon. The OSU Olea project then was sort of formed to address a handful of these challenges, primarily around cold hardiness. But we are tasked with assisting in making olive production economically feasible for commercial growers and home growers, honestly. A lot of the costs for commercial growers include buying plants from out of state, protecting them in the winter, also just losing trees because we get these cold snaps that will wipe out half an orchard, an entire orchard. There's some scary stories out there. We're also looking to adapt to climate limitations for growers, so finding hardy cultivars and growing methods that allow for successful growth of olives in Oregon. And thinking with an eye to the future in terms of what can we anticipate in terms of climate. And then we're compiling and disseminating information that we gather to our stakeholders, which is what we're doing right now. Hello, stakeholders. We're also working on a couple of videos for the Olive Project, so we'll be putting together some how-to guides and best practices on the various trials that we're conducting so that we can share them far and wide. So the research effort specifically is figuring out what the best propagation techniques are, and so Heather's the point person on this one. And the question is really, can you create your own cuttings? There's cost savings that go along with that if you can propagate your own plant material. And also it reduces the possibility of introducing pests from elsewhere. Because growing olives is so new in the state of Oregon, we don't have the olive pests that are, of economic impact in California and in Europe. So we're really grateful for that, and we'd like to keep it that way. So if we can figure out what the best ways of propagating in Oregon are and share that information, we will be doing a great service. It went out of order. Interesting. Well, is it gonna do? Oh, there we go. Number 2. Okay, well, you get to see the end of the slide before you were supposed to. But the second task is to evaluate cultivars for cold hardiness. So figuring out which cultivars of olives are actually going to survive in Oregon below 15 degrees, below 10 degrees, and which ones are not only going to survive those winters, but which ones are going to thrive in those winters, because ideally we'll have happy, healthy olives that just want to be in Oregon's rich clay soils and in Oregon's colder, wetter winters. And then lastly, we are conducting an up-potting evaluation. And up-potting is moving plants from smaller pots to bigger pots and keeping them in a greenhouse or storage for the winter, and seeing if older trees do they survive better? Do we set them up for success if we plant them at older dates and if they are larger trees? And if the answer is yes, how big do they need to be? Like, is it sufficient to, do it for 1 year? Do you have to do it for 3 years? And we'll go into that a little bit more. And we'll start with Heather's propagation trial.
All right, so we're going to pass it back and forth again here. So as Victoria gave a very nice introduction to my project. So as she said, I'm focusing on the propagation trial because we are interested in assisting growers who want to be able to grow their own plants from cuttings. And so Olives are own rooted. So many of them are grown from their own cuttings. Some can be tissue cultured and that sort of thing, but this is a pretty easy process for us to start looking at. And as Victoria said, growers need to purchase their olives in California for the most part. For homeowners, we'll talk a little bit more about retail nurseries and that sort of thing. But for large quantities, right now, most growers are going to California to get them, which can be, a little bit challenging. And then they're also worried about bringing in pests that we don't have. So in order to address helping growers propagate their own plants, as you may know from propagation classes, that it's important to use, many of the times, to use rooting hormones. So we're trying to investigate which hormones may be best, looking at different kinds of media or substrate that you stick the cuttings into. And then, of course, it's important to look at the timing of cuttings. And of course, there's information about some of this out there in different places, but what we're doing is very unique to this region. And just because you want to take cuttings at a particular time in California or in Italy or another place doesn't mean that it's the best place, the best timing for Oregon, for example. So here is a photo of two of the students working with the cuttings that we've taken from a local olive field. And so you can see that they have some cuttings that have been taken from the trees, and then basically the same day as we've taken the cuttings, we've used those, like you can see the branches that they have there, that would be made into probably 2 or 3 cuttings. And then you can see the different rooting hormones that we have there that those students are sticking the cuttings into, and then they're placed into those flats and they're randomized and placed onto a mist bench. So here's some of the results that we had from one of the trials, and I'm not going to go into the specifics necessarily of which hormones we were looking at because we want to talk more about homeowner things next, so we didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just so you can kind of see what they look like after they have been in the greenhouse on mist this is for 90 days. And so that's the one thing to note, is that olives can take a long time to root, more so than if you're rooting a spirea or a hydrangea or something else that can root really quickly. These can be slow and challenging to root. So these were done with Arbequina, and they are pretty easy rooters in comparison to some of the others. So like I said, we evaluated after 90 days. Another thing to note is that we did a trial last fall, and we just stuck this trial last week. We're repeating that, where we're looking at sticking cuttings without mist, where we're just using those plastic hoods that you put over a flat, and we were able to root pretty successfully, getting 80% success rate doing that. So as a homeowner, if you have a friend that has an olive tree, you could go and take a cutting, use some rooting hormone, stick it in a pot, put a plastic bag over it or a little hood over it, stick it in your window. And, if this was done in the fall, so keep that, you can't do it in the summertime, but if you did it in the fall or later in the year, thanks, Victoria, you could do that as a homeowner as well. So, but look, there is, when you look at the results there, you can see there are differences between hormones that we're finding.
Okay. So once you figured out how to propagate them, we're also evaluating the different cultivars for cold hardiness. You can see well, maybe you can see in the foreground. The hard thing about photographing olives is that it's a green tree on a green background. But if you cannot see it, just trust me when I say that there is evidence of cold damage here. There's lots of some dead branches there in the foreground on this little olive tree in the verdant rolling hills of Oregon. But this is sort of the cold damage that we see for olives that have gone through a harder winter. They die back, and then they spend all of their energy regrowing rather than putting on flowers and putting on fruit and giving us our tasty, tasty olives. So what we're doing with this cold hardiness evaluation is we are trying to amass as many cultivars as possible and put them in the ground and see which ones do the best. It's as simple as that. But it is sort of a fun challenge to figure out where we're going to get these cultivars. Most of the plants that we have right now, we have procured from the USDA germplasm repository in California. Also, there is a certified plant nerd, and our friend Mike Remick, who had a sizable collection of olives on his own that he has donated to the olive research effort. And then we've also gotten some olives from nurseries like Time Olives and One Green World to sort of flesh out our collection. And you would think, well, if you want more olive cultivars, why don't you just go to Europe and the Mediterranean, where there are tons of olive cultivars? And the answer is we'd love to. And the second answer is there is an import ban on olives into the United States right now, based off of pest pressures. I believe it's a stem borer for
citrus borer or some sort of borer.
Citrus borer.
Longhorn borer, yes.
Yeah, that's not actually for olives. It's just olives are included in the ban because we're being extra careful. So Neil Bell is working on getting a controlled import permit for olive cultivars from Europe. He's got his eyes on this germplasm repository in Madrid, Spain, where most of the olive production in the world currently happens. And they have all these really fun cultivars. But stay tuned because it's a long process. And for now, we are planting out the stock block we're planning out the cultivar cold hardiness evaluation in 2021. To figure out which of those cultivars do the best with our winters, which ones have the most vigor, which ones put on the most flowers, put on the most fruit, yada, yada, yada. But namely, which ones are going to survive those cold winters. And it's going to be a really fun thing to figure out. Right now, you can go see these olives if you wanted to. This is a picture of the stock block at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center up in Aurora. And they're just hanging out in the ground and doing pretty well. We also have another research plot at Woodhall Vineyard, which is in Alpine, Oregon, out by Alsea.
Yeah, and I was going to say, there's what, about 100 plants or 100 accessions that we have? Is that correct, that Neil has for?
Oh yeah, we have over 100 accessions of olives. So
lots
all
of cool
sorts
stuff.
of fun things. From Greek to French to, there's some Russian varieties in there. Super fun stuff. The majority of them I can't pronounce, but it's a whole lot of fun to try. And this is just a photo here of the National Colloidal Germplasm Repository in Davis, California, where we've gotten most of our cultivars. They only let you have 30 at a time, so we're doing our darndest to acquire as many through those means. But they have a lot of really cool olives there that have been, a lot of these olives have been in California since the 1800s when the missions were growing olive orchards. And a lot of them, we're not even sure if they are distinct cultivars or if they're just renamed varieties of the same plant. So there's lots to learn in the world of olives.
All right, so we're going to hand off here again. So I'm going to talk about the up-potting trial a little bit. And as Victoria said, we're looking at, what is the best size of plant or age of plant to plant in the ground. And this is based on growers' observations. They found that, if they plant trees that were larger or trees that were more established, if they had a cold spell a particular winter, the larger trees survived, which, that completely makes sense. And so the hard thing is about that is that they don't have trials that are replicated. There isn't, it's all kind of based on observation. They have all kinds of different trees of different ages. So we want to add some science to the process and look at, what really is the best age. If you plant, a larger plant, a 3-gallon versus a 1-gallon, is that, get you what you need, or is a 1-gallon okay? What really is the optimal size? And then we'll be looking at also spring versus fall planting. I would say if you're a homeowner and you're looking to plant an olive tree and you can water your tree, which I would highly recommend, spring planting is probably the safest because that tree can grow on and get a little bit more established before winter. But some of our growers are, they're dry growing these trees, so they aren't adding a lot of irrigation after they're planted. So we kind of want to look at fall planting and see, would that work out? And I think it's a little bit risky, so to speak, because the plant isn't as established as you go into winter, but it's something we want to look at. So here's some pictures from the up potting trial. So you can see the plants as they come in from the nursery. They're 4-inch pots, and then they're getting planted into the 1 gallons there on the top right. And then so some plants will go in the field at the 1 gallon stage, and then some will stay in for an additional year and then get up potted to a 3. And then we'll also have some 5-gallon plants in the trial that will also be going in. And so each year we're planting in different sizes. So of course, different winters are going to have different low temperatures. So that way we're able to kind of compare how those different sizes survive over winter. And so this is a picture of one of the test plots. So this is the one at the North Willamette. As Victoria mentioned, we also have a site in Alpine, Oregon, which is a sloped site. So typically, as I mentioned, olive growers are growing on slopes. And that is so there isn't a lot of cold, kind of puddling around the plant, so to speak, so the cold air isn't settling. So this is kind of we'll see what happens with this flatland site at the North Willamette. And we'll see how it does in comparison to the site at Woodhall in Alpine.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I knew I wanted to mention the 2 sites for a reason, but the one at NREC is really for the flatland agriculture, and the one at Woodpine is to compare on slopes, because a lot of our olive growers are growing on more marginal lands, and a lot of them are vineyard owners who are looking to diversify or add something to their operation. So enough about that. Let's talk about home gardening, because that's the fun stuff. That's what we're here for. And how to actually grow these things rather than just thinking about where they come from and whether or not they're going to survive your winters. We would like to know whether you all are actually growing olives, and if you're doing it successfully, if you're doing it not so successfully, if you don't want to grow them at all, but if you're not growing them currently but you'd like to, or if you're not interested at all and you're just hanging out on a Thursday webinar.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch another poll. So you'll look for that box to pop up here. And should be able to see that now and make your choices. Looks like they're coming in, so we'll give it a few more seconds. And again, as you're thinking about questions that you have for the presenters, make sure to use the Q&A box and we'll keep track of those. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share those results.
Ooh.
So I'm not sure if everybody can see that. It looks like 51% are not, but they would love to. 31% are just interested in learning about them, maybe to answer Master Gardener questions. Nobody is here for the wrong webinar, so that's awesome.
That's a success in itself.
But 2 people out there are doing a good job, so we'll have to figure out who those folks are.
Great. Oh, I'm excited. Well, maybe they can help us answer some questions. Great. So for those of you out there who are thinking about adding olives to your plant collection, you can grow olives outdoors in your landscape, and they are beautiful additions to your landscape. They have this lovely silver leaves. Some of them have golden undersides. Olives naturally want to be pretty bushy rather than a tree, and so you can add some intrigue to your landscape if you wanted to add them in their bushy form, or if you wanted to prune them into fun shapes. You can also grow olives indoors, though you will not get any olives on your olive tree if you grow them indoors, because olives are wind pollinated, so they actually need pollen to be blown around, unless you're putting a fan on them, I suppose. They need the wind in order to produce olives. We'd also recommend don't bring your outdoor olive in so much. We've heard from nurseries that this practice, if you grow them in a pot outdoors and you bring them in for the winter time, you might actually send your plant into shock, and you'll stress them out. So it's not good to bring them, they're getting used to the colder temperatures, and you bring them into the warmer temperatures, and they don't often know what to do with that.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, we just heard from some nurseries that it's kind of a fad to, have an olive in your home. And I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, I guess they can do okay, but not necessarily recommended. But yeah, just in case anybody was thinking about it, we thought we would bring it up. But yeah, it can be hard to transition them in and out of the house. It can be stressful for the olives.
Yeah, I should say it's not recommended. This is a beautiful photo of an olive in a house, but who knows how long it will last.
Right, exactly.
So in terms of planting and spacing, if you're going to plant them outdoors, just in the landscape, all natural, they absolutely need full sun. Olives love to be in full sun, preferably south or west exposure, like most sun-loving plants. Olives will get pretty big if you let them. Some sources say that if you leave an olive unpruned, it will get up to 50 feet tall. Whoa! Most people do prune their olive trees, though, because either they like the aesthetic or they want to get olives, and so they want to keep the olives at a manageable height. So it's recommended to space them out about 10 to 20 feet apart, because they do like to take over, but also because they like to grow. That's why. Do watch out for cold pockets in your landscape. If you're thinking about planting them at the bottom of the hill or in a particularly chilly area, olives really don't do well with cold. And I think we've stressed this enough, but if you haven't heard it yet, olives do not want to be frozen, and they don't like to be cold. The photo here is of an olive planted directly into a landscape. It was grown in a container for about 10 years, and then it was planted into the ground, and has been growing in the ground for about 10 more years. I don't know if you can tell by this photo, but it's a huge bushy tree. There's a giant sunflower next to it, hopefully for scale, to show you that this is, they get large and they get bushy and they do need space. Don't try and put your olive in a tiny little corner just because you want one more thing. You can grow them well long-term in containers. I know plenty of people who do that, particularly because olives really like more marginal soils. And if you have really wet soils, or if you just don't have space for it, olives do really well in containers. Though you do have to protect the little guys, who are going to be they'll be more susceptible to cold if they're in a tiny pot outside in the wintertime, so you will want to offer them some sort of protection, either in the greenhouse or up against the sunny south side of a building or something. And I mentioned those, you might want to use containers because of soils, and that's because those native soils that they are accustomed to have a much higher pH than we do here. They're calcareous soils, and you can see just by this photo. I took this photo when we were at that olive orchard in France, and you can see in the top left corner there's actually some olives. But this is the type of soil that olives want to grow in. They want to grow in really marginal, rocky, well-drained soils, sort of the more marginal soils, and they do really well. For this reason, if you're going to put them in a pot, you're going to put them in a container, it's best to use a coarse potting mix, so that it is really well draining and they're not going to get wet feet and get grumpy that way. But if you're thinking you want to, you have this marginal land that might be good for it, hey, olives love crappy soil. And they like really well-drained soils. They also are really drought tolerant. They're sort of built for low water situations. They do, however, need water for establishment. So the first couple of years that you have olives, you're going to want to water them in and help them promote growth so they can get up to a bulkier size and survive the dry winters and also the drier summers and the colder winters. It's important, though, to reduce your supplemental irrigation going into the fall. We heard this from a couple of nurseries. You don't want your olives to be putting on a lot of vegetative growth going into the winter, because that tender vegetative growth is what is going to be most impacted by cold temperatures. If possible, right, we have rain in the fall here in Oregon. You want to reduce the irrigation that your olive trees are getting so they can have more of the older wood going into the winter time and not be so vulnerable to cold temperatures.
All right, so talking a little bit about fertility for olives, as Victoria mentioned multiple times, and we saw that lovely slide of the soils. You know, they're kind of used to poor quality soil, so these aren't plants that you need to apply tons of fertilizer to. If they are in containers, of course, they will need some, because containers will have soilless media in them, which aren't very nutrient rich. So in that case, it's recommended to use, you know, general fertilizer or like citrus and fruit tree fertilizer for those particular plants. If you're planting your olives in ground, as in any situation, you know, do a soil test and see if you do indeed need to apply fertilizer. But just kind of keep in mind that olives aren't necessarily super heavy feeders. And when you do fertilize, do so earlier in the season rather than later, for the same reason that Victoria was just talking about, that you don't want to apply late in the season and have them push on a whole bunch of new growth, you know, right into the winter season. So olives generally don't have a lot of pest issues here in Oregon. One of the pests that you may see is scale. And a lot of times this might come in from a nursery or from a different site, but so there is a black scale that can, you can see those two little black spots there on those olive leaves on the top photo, and that can cause sooty mold, which is kind of one of those bottom photos there. And so, you know, at low populations, it's not going to cause, you know, huge issues for your olives, but it's something to watch out for. And it can cause problems for the plants. Peacock spot is a fungal disease, and that's that yellow leaf on the bottom, and it tends to be an issue more so in fall as we get our wet weather, and so it can cause, you know, a little bit of defoliation. Some olive growers in Oregon will spray for this particular disease, but generally it's not a super critical problem, but it's something that you might see. Occasionally, twig borers can also be a problem in olives. And then the other thing that I just wanted to mention was, you know, leaf drop and that sort of thing, which you can see when Victoria showed the cold hardiness trial, and you could see that plant with all that leaf drop on it. You know, that's not obviously a pest or disease, but you might see that, you know, if the tree for some reason is stressed, they tend to kind of drop leaves. Some other things that could be a problem: deer can feed on olives a little bit, and then voles can be a bigger issue too as you're planting, and they can girdle the plants, and which can, of course, be very unfortunate.
And this is probably our #1 pest problem at our research sites, is the vole pressure getting underneath the weed mat.
Yeah, not so good. So as Victoria kind of mentioned earlier, you know, the olives oftentimes will end up wanting to grow as shrubs, especially in Oregon. And I don't know if this, you know, how heavily pruned the olive trees are in other places, you know, where you tend to see them more in tree form. But in Oregon, because of our cold temperatures, a lot of times the ends will get nipped, the tips will get nipped, or you might lose major branches even if the tree is young and we happen to have a cold winter. And so that will encourage basal shoots. And so many of the olive growers that we work with commercially have more shrubby forms of olive trees. And it's kind of easier to manage. And of course, you know, you've probably heard in commercial orchards as well, you don't necessarily want to be up on ladders and that sort of thing. So I think in some ways it's better to have them a little shorter if you're trying to harvest the olives, which are hand harvested in Oregon, which I forgot to mention. So they're all picked by hand. So in that case, don't be shocked, or hopefully you can, you know, have those expectations that your Oregon olive tree may end up growing more as a shrub. So If you do decide to do some pruning on the trees after they're a little bit more established, they're commonly pruned more in the open vase pruning method, kind of opening up the center, kind of brings an air to the tree, and then, like I said, makes it a little bit easier for harvesting. And then, as we've mentioned a few times, pruning in the fall can push growth. If you're pruning, more like in August or something, it might decide it wants to put out some new growth, which again can potentially cause issues for winter damage. So if you're going to do some pruning, try and do it earlier in the season. So the cool part about olives, of course, is the actual olives themselves. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the fruit isn't going to reach typically the full size or ripeness in Oregon. So the picture on the right there is actually one of our olive growers, and he brined those olives so you can kind of see the size and what they would look like. And actually, they were quite delicious. I tried some, so that's really cool that we can do that here. And they're going to take a little bit to be able to produce fruit. So 5 to 7 years, I would say at least. I'd say once you get closer to 10 years, then you're at better production and going to get more table olives. But kind of keep in mind that you're not going to get a ton of olives here in Oregon like you would in California or something like that. One thing to think about too is, as Victoria mentioned, that these are wind pollinated. In the native Mediterranean regions where olives are grown, it tends to be a little bit drier where we are. So if we happen to have rain when these are blooming and the wind is blowing the pollen, you might not get great pollination. So that's another thing to kind of think about. So generally yield is lower here than other places. And so if you were to be growing olives yourselves, think about table olives, not so much about making your own olive oil, for example. I mean, it takes a lot of olives in order to produce a gallon of olive oil. And like I said, they're smaller here. They're not as fully ripe, and so they're not producing as much oil. So kind of keep that in mind, that you would need to have a lot of olive trees in order to make your own olive oil.
Yeah, though it was a law that just passed for this Oregon State Legislature that you can process your own olive oil in your garage if you wanted to. Right.
If you want to, and you decide to start a small farm, yeah, you definitely could do that. But yeah, as a homeowner, just having a couple trees, probably not enough oil for enough olives for olive oil.
Yep.
So the question we always get is, what kind of olive tree should we plant? And so note that I have a couple kind of categories here. And so I have kind of an ornamental category and a fruit category. And I want to point out for the top three, they're the piqual, the mission, and Amphisa. Those do produce fruit, but I think the reason that they're on this list is because they have form and the coloration of their leaves is a little bit more attractive perhaps than some of the other olives. So you will get some fruit on these, but just kind of note that they're maybe more on the more ornamental side. The little ollie and the wilsoni, those are non-fruiting olives. And so little ollie, for example, is a shrub form of olive, and the wilsoni is a tree form. But as you can imagine, in other places, olives can be messy. If you have all these full black olives dropping all over your sidewalk, for example. So that's kind of the purpose of those. So if you just wanted a ornamental olive that didn't produce fruit, those are a couple options. In terms of fruiting cultivars, Victoria mentioned we're trying out over 100 different olives, and so there's a lot out there. And so it's kind of hard to point it out. Frantoio is something that a lot of growers are looking at. Licino as well. Arbequina is what has been commonly grown around here. Some growers like it and some growers do not like it. They do have a little bit smaller fruit as well. The olive with the green fruit in the top photo, I believe, is an Arbequina, and you can see the fruit is pretty small, and this was pretty close to harvest time. Casaveltrano is also known as Nocerella del Belize, and this one has a little bit larger fruit. I don't think that picture on the bottom is from Oregon, is what I should say here, is that you're going to get more like the top photo than the bottom photo as you're harvesting your olives. So kind of keep that in mind. But the Nocerella del Belize or the Castelveltrano has a little bit larger fruit than some of the others. But like I said, we're still looking at the hardiness. So it's a little bit hard to say, you need to plant this and you're not going to have issues, because we're still trying to figure this out. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that you'll need a pollinizer tree. So if you just have one olive tree, I mean, maybe you'll get a few olives, but they really do better with having another pollinizer. And Pendolino is what's used commercially, but yeah, some of these other ones, like I said, can help as pollinizers, but having something like Pendolino will help you get more fruit. But on the flip side of that, it's not necessarily the best olive on its own.
Yeah, and we should point out too that these cultivar recommendations are not anything that we have researched, and they're not there's no scientific information behind our recommendations here. These are anecdotally what we've heard from local nurseries and local growers as being cultivars that they prefer. And also that pollinizer trees, we have one grower who was having a really difficult time with fruit set, and then they brought in sort of a decorative tree to put at the top of the hill. I think it might have been an Arbequina or something like that, but they put a decorative tree at the top of the hill, and it blew all the pollen down, and suddenly their fruit set was amazing. So the pollinizer is not a joke. You really do need one of those.
Yeah, so some of the local retailers, there's a number of nurseries out there that do sell olives. There's a couple on this list that focus a little bit more on olives and more on kind of more unusual fruits. And so they tend to have they have a larger selection of different olives. So if you have something specific that you want, or you're looking for, or you have a lot of questions, some of those places might be good to go to or do some research before you head out. The other thing I have noticed is that there are some wholesale nurseries that grow olives and will sell to local garden centers, but a lot of times it's seasonal. So I noticed we had some olives in my local garden center this spring, but they're not there necessarily anymore. But so if you kind of shop around a little bit, there are some olive retailers out there. So I see that we're quickly running out of our hour worth of time, and so we're going to wrap up here. As we kind of talked about, generally olives are pretty low maintenance plants. They don't get a lot of pests. They're very drought tolerant once established. They do like well-drained, kind of rocky soil. So if you have a really wet, swampy area, probably not a good choice. But, they can be great plants and, really add a lot with their silvery evergreen foliage. They can look great in the garden. But keep in mind that, as we stressed, I think multiple times, really at the edge of the hardiness zone here in Western Oregon. And so if there is a way to protect small plants in containers and, move them to the garage for, those days we have, 20 degrees or something, that might be beneficial, or, do something to protect them. But, obviously once you're in the landscape, it's a little tougher to do that. But, that's where we're talking about potentially planting larger plants just in case you have a cold season. And then over time, these plants can really take off and grow well. So yeah, they can really be a center point of your yard if you have some space for them.
Cool.
Right. And then I wanted to thank the following individuals for kind of answering a few of our questions that we had. And then I also want to thank Western SARE for the funding that we've received to do our research project. With that, we have a few minutes for questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather and Victoria. Again, can't hear them clapping, but there's 90 people out there clapping for you. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. So we do have a few minutes. I don't know what your schedule is, if you're okay taking a few minutes after 12 to follow up on questions.
Yeah.
All the questions are recorded though, so if we aren't able to answer your question during the live webinar, we'll get that to the presenters and they might be able to answer some things offline or direct you. So while you're thinking of what questions you have, our next webinar is Friday, November 8th. We're going to have Erin Posthumus from the U.S. National Phenology Network joining us to talk about citizen science, and a recording of this webinar will also go out to everyone with those details. So. And I see Denise is clapping on the chat, so awesome. Okay, so Greg has a question. He has neighbors that have Arbequina. And there's two, and they're 10 years old, but they've never produced fruit.
Right. So
So
they're both arbequinas?
that's what he's saying. Yep.
Yeah, so they probably want a pollinizer tree. That would help them out.
Gotcha. So even if it's one in a little container and if it's flowering, maybe they'll get some fruit. Okay.
Yeah. Greg, plant a pendolino.
Yeah, they need to add another cultivar of olive.
Nice. Let's see. Joanne has a question about growing olives in windy areas. How is the root system of olive trees?
Yeah, so they are shallowly rooted, so it potentially could be an issue. I don't know if you've heard of any lodging of trees, Victoria, or, I mean, I think in general, I could see, how staking a tree could be beneficial because, like I said, they don't have a really deep root system. So if you're someplace that does get a lot of winds regularly, I mean, I don't think I don't know of a lot of problems here locally, but we're not in, where my area isn't hugely windy, but yeah, if you had some strong winds, I think through the nature of how they root, I could see that being
one of those winter storms that comes through.
Right.
And,
I haven't heard of any of our Oregon growers dealing with this, but that's something that I've heard from the California nurseries, the Texas nurseries, like, be careful of wind.
Gotcha. Thank you. Jim has a question about olive mills, the presses. Does that happen here in Oregon, or do the growers, do they need to ship their olives to California to make oil?
Yeah, we have one commercial olive mill in the state, which is operated by Red Ridge or Durant Farms out in Yamhill County. I think they're in Dayton.
Dayton, yeah.
And they are the sort of commercial olive producers the commercial olive millers for the state. That's our one and only. Growers from all over the state send their olives there, and they can get processed either under the Durant label or for personal label, whichever. But you can, if you're interested, I mean, I mentioned this law that just got passed. There, you can buy a mill, and you can now process olives for oil at your own home, and it's under the sort of like that home baking bill, where you could, as long as you're, I don't know the requirements, under a certain amount of income, you can sell your own olive oil.
Oh, like a farmer's market size. Oh, great. We have someone that sounds like they're from Eastern Oregon, Wasco County. Are there any possibilities of growing olives? Because I saw on your map, it's all Willamette Valley. What about the whole rest of our state?
Yeah. I would ask you if you get below 10 or 15 degrees regularly. Because for us over here, it's a once in a, it's pretty rare event that you'd get below 10. But I imagine out there it's got to be a lot more common. So I would say it's probably not recommended unless you're, have it in a container on your patio and have a greenhouse that you move it in the wintertime or something.
Great, thank you. Mary Jo says she realizes that olives are wind pollinated, but do you ever see bees or other pollinators foraging on those trees?
Yes. Yeah, so actually I had a master gardener that I was talking to the other day about her olive trees, and she works with the Oregon Bee Project. And so she said she actually collected some bees off of her olive trees. So as you said, they're wind pollinated. So I think they're kind of using that pollen as a source of protein. But yeah, apparently they can be a source of food for bees.
Awesome.
Cool stuff.
Yeah, very good. So we'll just take one last question. And again, all of these questions are recorded and linked to your email. And so we'll give them to the presenters, and they can follow up if it's something that wasn't answered already in the presentation. And we'll send out a link, and so that you'll have contact information that you can follow up with the presenters as too. That was one of our other questions. But before we go, so Annette has a 3-year-old tree, and it's in a container on the south side. In the ground, but she wants to know if she should leave it there for in the fall, or move it into a garage over the winter. So is that something, I know that I think it was Victoria, you said not to like move them from outdoors into a home environment. Could you overwinter in a garage where that temperature extreme is not so much?
Yeah, the difficulty with moving them into your home is that, like, you know, like right about now, people are thinking about moving their trees in for the winter, but our nighttime temperatures are already getting down into the 40s and 30s. And if you bring them into your home's probably kept at 65, 70, and so you're pulling them. They're getting ready for winter, and then you pull them out of it. But you could keep them in a garage to protect them from the worst of it, as long as you've got light in your garage.
Right. I was going to say that's the thing. I mean, you don't want to put them in a real dark space. I mean, and I don't know if it's possible to, you know, I mean, generally they're going to be fine in Western Oregon, you know, with our winter conditions. But, you know, if you had the ability to maybe just move it if there is, you know, a major cold snap or something coming. Otherwise, I mean, I think it's probably going to really be happier outdoors. But, you know, as in terms of long term, I mean, if you're going to do it, I wouldn't do it for the entire winter necessarily, because I don't think it's really necessary most of the time.
Yeah, and 3 years might be getting to the point where, like, it might be okay.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the size, you know, if it's starting to get some caliper and yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. And like Scott put in the chat box here, he says, thank you and good luck to everyone on their olive endeavors. So thanks everyone for attending, and look for that recording and evaluation in your email. Thanks.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks for all of your olive questions.
Love it.
I love it.
Bye everyone.